I'm super excited to have the opportunity to share with you all some of my PhD research on safe machine learning-based perception via closed-loop analysis. Okay, so I want to spend the first few minutes of this talk just sort of breaking down this title and discussing the meaning and motivation behind each component, starting with safe machine learning. And before I talk about safe machine learning, I just want to briefly mention some things about machine learning in general. So machine learning has enabled tremendous advancements in the automation of tasks across a wide variety of domains. For example, we can use it to now play games with performance that meets or even exceeds human level. We can use it to estimate the structures of proteins. And possibly most notably as of recent, it's been a key enabler behind the recent advances in large language models such as ChatGPT. And by the way, ChatGPT would not predict how this thesis defense is going to go, but it did at least wish me luck. Okay, and so all of these tremendous advancements really only scratch the surface of what machine learning has been allowed us to do over the last decade or so. And so it should really come as no surprise that there's also lots of opportunity for machine learning for automation of safety critical systems. So for example, autonomous aircraft, self-driving cars, medical robotics, all of these safety critical systems have the potential to benefit greatly from the capabilities of machine learning. However, there is a catch, which is that these systems are safety critical. And so if our automation of them were to fail in some way, the outcome of these failures can be quite catastrophic, potentially resulting in loss of property or even human life. And so for this reason, automation of these systems tends to be heavily regulated and require a very significant validation effort. And this validation effort is already quite significant for the traditional forms of automation that have been deployed today. So for example, model-based methods such as model-based control or computer vision. And it turns out that machine learning actually only adds complexity to this already significant validation process. And let me illustrate why with an example of a neural network. So neural networks are machine learning models that are behind a lot of the advancements that I've mentioned so far. And while we often represent neural networks pictorially like this, it turns out that neural networks are really just big mathematical formulas. So we can write out the mathematical formula that this small neural network represents, and it looks something like this. Okay, so this neural network, I would say, is quite tiny by today's standards. It only has 12 units total in it, but the mathematical formula for this network is already quite complicated. It's pretty difficult for us to just look at this formula and understand exactly what it's doing, let alone when or if it might fail. And so for this reason, it's really important that we develop tools for us to be able to safely design and analyze these big mathematical formulas that neural networks represent. So that's been the focus of a lot of my PhD research and also the focus of a lot of researchers all over the world recently. And what gets me really, really excited about this domain is that if we can actually put in this extra effort to come up with tools to be able to ensure that these big mathematical formulas or machine learning models will operate safely, we have the potential to unlock a whole bunch of capabilities that these safety critical systems did not have previously. Okay, but with all of that said, it is probably going to require a lot of extra effort to put these machine learning models on safety critical systems. And so for this reason, at least for their early adoption, it's quite likely that we're only going to want to deploy them for tasks where they cannot already be solved entirely by more traditional forms of automation. And I would argue that one of these tasks is perception. So perception systems use sensors to take in data about the environment around them, and then typically process that data into some sort of interpretable state of the world that they can use downstream for decision making. And where I think machine learning is going to be really, really key for the perception task is when we have sensors that output very high dimensional data. So for example, camera sensors which output image data. And here's an example of two image-based perception systems that I've used as case studies in my research. They're both related to the aviation domain. On the left, we have an example of a vision-based aircraft detect and avoid system, where we assume that we have a camera that's mounted on the aircraft that's taking pictures of the surrounding sky. And those images are then fed through a neural network, which is responsible for detecting potential intruding aircraft in the sky so that we can avoid colliding with them. And on the right, we have a similar setup where we have a camera that's mounted on the wing of the aircraft. It's taking images of the runway this time, and we're essentially feeding those images through a neural network in order to safely steer the aircraft down the runway. And so we want to ensure that before we deploy machine learning-based systems like this, that they're going to operate safely, since these are very safety-critical tasks for our systems. And to do this, one key tool that I've used in all of my research contributions is closed-loop analysis. Closed-loop analysis allows us to analyze the behavior of systems over time, and in turn, that allows us to test high-level safety properties. So I'll illustrate this with an aircraft collision avoidance example, where we assume that we have an own-ship aircraft, which is our aircraft, and then we're trying to avoid an intruder aircraft in the airspace. And for now, we're going to assume that the own-ship and intruder are both in level flight, and the intruder is above the own-ship. So an open-loop property that we might specify in a scenario like this could be something like, if the intruder is above the own-ship and they're both in level flight, the own-ship should always descend. So for this particular scenario, this was actually pretty intuitive for us to specify. And we can also easily check this property by just seeing what the collision avoidance system recommends in this scenario. But let's change up this scenario slightly so that the own-ship is now climbing. So in this scenario, we might want the own-ship to still descend, but it's also possible that we might want the own-ship to continue climbing so that it can cross altitude with the intruder before a potential collision. And the point that I'm trying to make here is just that it's not so obvious anymore what open loop property we should specify for this particular scenario. And in general, when we design systems, it's not always obvious based on our intuition what open loop properties we need to specify for all possible scenarios that our systems might be in. And so another way to illustrate this drawback, let's go back to the previous scenario we had and assume that we do actually, in fact, want the aircraft to descend. And let's play out the scenario a few time steps forward into the future. So you can see now, most of the time it did actually satisfy our open loop property and tell the aircraft to descend. But there's one time step where it incorrectly told the aircraft to climb. And so an open loop analysis is just going to flag this open loop safety violation and conclude that the system is unsafe. However, the true or primary intended safety objective of an aircraft collision avoidance system is to, in fact, avoid collisions. And this system did not actually result in a collision. And so while this might be undesirable behavior, what we might rather do in a scenario like this is just specify a closed loop property that says the aircraft should not collide. So this is much higher level. It's much easier for us to specify based on the intended safety objectives of the system. And it also better reflects those objectives. So for example, in a scenario like this, we could actually check against this closed loop property and still conclude that our system is behaving safely. So given all of this motivation, I've made 4 key contributions related to this title. And they can be broadly separated into 2 main categories. The first category is safety verification, and the second category is safe design. So for safety verification, we assume that we have already designed a system that we think is safe, and now we want to formally prove that the system does in fact satisfy the safety properties that we set out to design it for. However, to do this, we have to somehow come up with a system that we think is safe. And so in the second half of my talk, I'm going to talk about contributions related to safe design, where we talk about how we could actually go about designing a system like this in the first place. So I'll spend the rest of this talk discussing each of these contributions. I'll spend most of my time on the first 3 contributions, and then I'll briefly dive into the last one. So starting with the first contribution on generating probabilistic safety guarantees. I'll mention before I dive in here that this contribution does not actually directly relate to verifying perception systems. However, it does lay the foundation for the next contribution I'll talk about on verifying image-based neural networks. So in the meantime, the primary motivation for this work is that previous work on reachability analysis at the time did not really account for stochasticity in the system dynamics. And so what do I mean by this? I'll use an aircraft collision avoidance example again. And this time we're going to assume that the own-ship and intruder are co-altitude. And on board the own-ship is a neural network-based aircraft collision avoidance system. And so this neural network essentially takes in the true state of the aircraft, which reflects the relative geometry between the own-ship and intruder. And then it outputs a recommended collision avoidance action to take in order to avoid colliding with the intruder. And that could be something like climb or descend. Here I'm showing a 2D slice of the state space, where on the vertical axis, we have the relative altitude between the own-ship and intruder. And on the horizontal axis, we have the own-ship vertical rate. So one very simple sort of reachability analysis we could do in a scenario like this, some might just call it a trajectory rollout, is we could look at the state that we're currently in. So in this case, 0 relative altitude and 0 on-ship vertical rate. We can pass this state through our neural network aircraft collision avoidance policy and see what action it recommends we take. So in this case, it recommends we take the action descend at 1,500 feet per minute. And so using a dynamics model of the system, we can then assume that we take this action and simulate the system one step forward in time. And once we've done this, this brings us to a new state, and we can just repeat this process. So we can feed this state through our neural network, simulate one step forward in time, see where we end up, and repeat this for some desired number of time steps. And then once we're done, we can look at these trajectories that resulted and see whether or not they result in any safety violations. So in this case, the aircraft don't collide, so we can conclude that it was safe. But there's one issue here, which is that we just concluded it was safe for this very specific scenario of this exact start state for the ownership and intruder. But since the state space is continuous, there's actually an infinite number of states we could possibly be in or possibly start in. And so if we wanted to produce any guarantees, we would actually have to simulate an infinite number of these trajectories in order to ensure that it's safe in all possible scenarios. And unfortunately, we don't have time to simulate an infinite number of trajectories. And so we need to come up with a different solution. So one thing that we can do is bring back a solution that was developed by one of my co-authors on this paper and also one of my former lab mates, Kyle Julian, on reachability analysis for neural network controllers. And the way that Kyle dealt with the fact that there's an infinite number of states is by partitioning the state space into a finite number of cells. And then we can perform reachability analysis that looks very similar to our trajectory rollout, but on these set of cells. So we start by assuming that we start in some set of initial cells. For simplicity, we're just going to assume we start in the cell that contains this current state. And then we need to, just like our trajectory rollout, figure out what action we're going to take. But there's one issue we run into here, which is that we're not just talking about a single state anymore. We're talking about a continuous region in our state space. So even for this small region, there's an infinite number of states, and we can't just pass an infinite number of points through our neural network. So what we need to do here is actually use one of those verification tools that I was alluding to earlier that analyze those big mathematical formulas that neural networks represent in order to provide guarantees. And I'm not really going to go into the details of how these tools work, but if you're interested, here's a link to a survey paper that our lab wrote, and also an introductory YouTube video on the topic that I made a couple of years ago. But for the purposes of this talk, we're just going to assume, or I'm going to tell you, that these neural network verification tools can take in this continuous region in the state space and provide us a guarantee on all possible actions that the neural network could output for any state in that continuous region. So in this case, it turns out there's only one possible action in this cell, and that's descend at 1,500 feet per minute. And then very similarly to our trajectory rollout that we were doing previously, we can now just assume that we take this action from any state in this cell and see what next states are possible. There's one other really nice feature of this type of analysis, which is now we can actually account for multiple outcomes of taking a possible action. So for simplicity, we're just going to assume that when the ownership is told to descend, it just descends in the same way. But now we're going to relax this assumption a little bit on the intruder, because the intruder is just another aircraft that's flying in the airspace. We don't actually know the trajectory that it's following. And so it's possible that it will just continue in level flight at the next time step, but it's also possible that it might climb or descend. And so in order to account for this, we can actually just incorporate all of these possible outcomes into our set of reachable next cells. And then similarly to our trajectory rollout, we can continue to repeat this process for some desired number of steps. And then once we're done, we can check whether there was any cells or any states that were in a cell that contained dangerous states. So in other words, in this case, there was a cell that contained collision states that was reachable. And so it corresponds to this particular path taken by the intruder shown in red. And I would consider this path to be somewhat adversarial. So the intruder actually selected the same exact action as the ownership at every time step until they eventually collided. And so while this is possible that this might happen, I would argue that it's probably unlikely. However, a deterministic reachability analysis like this is just going to conclude that collision states are reachable, so the system must be unsafe. And so what we might rather do is actually assign probabilities to these various outcomes that can happen when we take an action. And instead of saying, yes, collision states are reachable, we can say, yes, they're reachable, but with some low probability. So in other words, we want to generate probabilistic safety guarantees. And the way that we propose to do this involves two main steps. The first is to modify Markov decision process, or MDP model checking, to work with neural network controllers. And to do this, we have to introduce some over-approximation into the model checking process. And so we found that it was really critical for us to actually minimize this over-approximation error that we introduced along the way in order to produce meaningful safety guarantees. So starting to just dive into each of these steps, starting with the MDP model checking step. Essentially, without going into too many details of how MDP model checking works, I'll just say that it's a method that allows us to use dynamic programming to determine the probability of satisfying a safety property when we start from any state in our state space and use our neural network policy. So for example, for the aircraft collision avoidance problem, we can use it to determine a probability of near midair collision, or NMAC, when starting from any state in our state space. And this is essentially exactly the type of probabilistic guarantee that we were looking for. However, there's one issue here, which is a very similar issue to the issue we ran into with the reachability analysis, which is that the state space is continuous, there's an infinite number of states, and we can't actually calculate this probability for all infinite states. And so we take a very similar approach here, and we partition our state space into a finite number of cells. We then introduce some over approximations to the model checking process so that it can work with cells rather than states. And when we do this, we have a method that can now give us an over approximated probability of near midair collision when starting from any cell in our space of possible cells. So here's what this looks like for the aircraft collision avoidance problem. Here I'm showing a different 2D slice of the state space, where on the vertical axis, I still have the relative altitude between the own-ship and intruder aircraft. But now on the horizontal axis, I'm showing this variable we call tau. And so tau represents the time to closest point of horizontal approach. And so in other words, when tau is near 0, that means we've lost almost all of our horizontal separation with the intruder aircraft. So it's really important that we have a high vertical separation at this point, or a very non-zero vertical separation or relative altitude. So this plot on the left is showing the partition of the state space into those cells, where the different colors correspond to a different number of actions that are possible in these cells. And the plot on the right is showing this over-approximated probability of collision that we were calculating for all states in this 2D slice of the state space. And so if we assume that our encounters get initialized with 40 seconds until we lose our horizontal separation with the intruder, we can use the probability of collision at tau equals 40 as a way to make safety claims about our system. However, if we look right now, the current estimated probability of collision at tau equals 40 is approximately 1. And since this is an over approximation, what this tells us is that our probability of collision is less than or equal to 1. So I really didn't need any fancy model checking to tell me that. And so we realized at this point that we were going to have to introduce some other principal techniques to minimize this over approximation error that we introduced if we actually want to produce meaningful safety guarantees. So the way that we propose to do this is to draw on ideas from state abstraction in Markov decision processes to develop an online splitting heuristic that essentially identifies very key areas of the state space for us to very finely partition so that we can minimize this over approximation error during the solving process. And so I'm going to hit play on a video in a second. I want you to pay attention to this region of the state space. You notice that there's kind of a dark band forming here. And essentially what this represents is just very finely discretized cells in our state space. So we're very finely partitioning these key regions of the state space. And in doing so, we're able to get rid of a whole bunch of this over approximation error that we had previously. To the point where now the probability of collision at tau equals 40 is quite low. And we can actually make meaningful safety claims about our system. So to summarize, for this contribution, I talked about how we can generate probabilistic safety guarantees for neural network controllers. We do this by modifying a traditional MDP model checking formulation to work with neural network controllers. To do this, we had to introduce some over approximations. And so we came up with some principled ways to minimize this over approximation error along the way. Okay, so both of the methods that I just discussed for this previous contribution assumed that we had a neural network controller that took in the true state of the system. And I'll call those state-based neural network controllers. And now I want to talk about how we can extend these techniques to neural network controllers that take in image observations of the current state. And I'll call these image-based neural network controllers. For this particular section, I'm going to use a running example of an aircraft taxi problem, where we have an aircraft that's situated somewhere on a runway. And we're going to represent its state using its cross-track or distance to center line and its heading. Before I talk about what an image-based neural network controller might look like for this scenario, I want to just briefly talk about what a state-based controller would look like. So state-based neural network controller would just take in both of these inputs and output a control action. And in this case, it's a steering angle, which is responsible for steering the aircraft safely down the runway. And by the way, I don't think I would recommend, if you have access to the true state, I don't think I'd recommend using a neural network for this task. This is just for demonstration purposes. Okay, and given this scenario, there's a couple safety properties that we might be interested in. The first is, will the neural network controller ever guide the aircraft to leave the runway, which could of course be dangerous. And the second property says, not only do we want our neural network controller to keep the aircraft on the runway, but ideally it should keep it near the center of the runway. And it turns out that using these state-based neural network verification techniques that I talked about previously, we can actually answer both of these questions for our state-based neural network controller. So to answer the first question, we can use the method I discussed for generating probabilistic safety guarantees to determine an over-approximated probability of leaving the runway when starting from any cell in our state space. So what I'm showing here is essentially the state space, where on the horizontal axis, I have the cross-track, and on the vertical axis, I have the heading. And any gray state that you see here belong to a cell for which the over-approximated probability of leaving the runway was 0. So in other words, if we start in any gray state that you see here, we're guaranteed, if we use our state-based neural network controller, to stay on the runway from there on out. To check the second property, we can use the forward reachability analysis that I discussed in the previous section, where we assume that we start in some set of initial states that covers the runway, and then we check what states are reachable over time using our state-based neural network controller. And here you can see it converges to a region near the center of the state space, which also corresponds to being near the center of the runway. So we're able to check both of these properties for our state-based neural network controller. And what's really nice about these techniques is that they were able to work for this problem. And there's also a lot of other techniques that have been developed for verifying state-based closed loop properties of state-based neural network controllers over the last few years. And they all rely on kind of different techniques for mathematics. But essentially, most of these techniques rely on two key properties of state-based neural network controllers in order for them to be tractable. And the first property is that the inputs to these controllers tend to be low dimensional. So typically, we can take the physical state of the system and compact it down into some relatively low dimensional state vector. And for the aircraft taxi problem, the state was 2-dimensional, so we can even visualize it. And one of the reasons for this is, you might remember, we were partitioning the state space into a set of cells. And the number of cells required for this is going to grow exponentially with the input dimension. And so it's really important that we keep that input dimension low in order for these techniques to remain tractable. The second property, which is, I would argue, is potentially even more key, is that the set of plausible inputs to these controllers tends to be well-defined. So we know that we could input any number for the cross-track and heading into this neural network and get out a steering angle, but we really only expect to encounter or expect our controller to work for a subset of those numbers. So in this case, we can identify the range of cross-tracks that we expect our aircraft to be in when we deploy it. And similarly, we can identify a range of plausible headings. And it turns out that these ranges just make a nice rectangle in the input space, so it's also very easy for us to represent mathematically. Okay, but our ultimate goal here is to actually verify image-based neural network controllers. So let's see how these properties hold up when we replace our state input with an image observation of this state. So in this case, as I mentioned earlier, we have a camera that's mounted on the wing of the aircraft that's taking pictures of the runway. We downsample these images and then pass them through our neural network, which still is responsible for outputting a steering angle. Okay, so let's see how these properties hold up now. So even for our small downsampled image, it still has 128 pixels in it. So our input to the neural network is now 128 dimensional. So our inputs are no longer low dimensional. And I would also argue that the set of plausible inputs is no longer well defined. Because we know that we could input any grayscale image of the proper dimensions into this neural network and get out a steering angle. But we really only expect our neural network to work for a subset of this space, which is the set of inputs that look something like a runway. And this is much, much more difficult to actually write down mathematically, because it would require us to define the full set of images in pixel space that looks something like a runway. And so with these properties breaking down, these state-based verification techniques that have been developed previously kind of go out the window, and we're left having to come up with some new techniques. So the way that we propose to address this involves three main steps. The first is to train a generative model to approximate the set of plausible inputs. So this kind of gets at that challenge we had previously of the set not being well defined. And then once we do this, we can actually concatenate this generative model with the control network that we want to verify. And I'll show in a few slides that this actually will end up looking a lot like the state-based neural network controllers that we were able to verify previously. And so we can bring back all of these techniques we had for verifying state-based neural network controllers to verify image-based neural network controllers. However, these guarantees that we produce are only going to be as good as this generative model is at actually approximating the set of plausible input images. And so our third step here is to actually validate this generative model using a recall metric that we developed. Okay, so diving into each of these steps a little bit more, starting with training the generative model. We know that you could use essentially any type of generative model for this work, but we chose to use a generative adversarial network or GAN architecture for our particular example or application. And I'm not really going to go into the details of how GANs work, but essentially what they've done right, they leave us with this generator network that takes in the true state of the system, so the cross-track and heading, and some set of latent variables, and then outputs a corresponding image observation. To see what this kind of looks like in practice, here's a sample trajectory where on the top and middle, I'm showing the true full res and downsampled images for this trajectory. And on the bottom, I'm showing the closest corresponding generated image. And so you can see that at least visually, there's pretty good agreement between these generated and true images. So once we have this generative model, we can move on to what's arguably the most important step in this analysis, which is to concatenate it with our control network to verify safety. So as a reminder, we have this generative model now that maps from states and latent variables to image observations. We also have this image-based neural network controller that we want to verify that maps from image observations to control actions. And so noting that the output of this generative model is the same as the input to our control network, we can actually just concatenate these two networks to obtain a single network that maps from a low-dimensional, well-defined set of states and latent variables to control actions. And this looks a lot like the state-based neural network controllers that we were able to verify previously. And it turns out, even more importantly, it actually satisfies those really key properties that we needed for those state-based verification techniques to remain tractable. And so what we can do is actually just apply those exact same techniques to this concatenated model. And it gives us guarantees now over our image-based neural network controller. So looking at that first safety property, here's the guarantees we can get for the image-based neural network controller compared to the ones we got for the state-based controller. And similarly for that second safety property, we can simulate forward in time and see what set of states is reachable. Well, you might notice that these guarantees are a little bit more conservative for our image-based neural network controller. We're still able to produce meaningful safety guarantees. Okay, however, all of those guarantees I just showed are entirely with respect to this generative model that we trained. So it's really important that this generative model is actually doing a good job at capturing this set of plausible inputs. So to test this, we created a recall metric that essentially tries to answer the question, how well can the generative model produce the real images that we expect to encounter when we deploy the system? And just to demonstrate this in action, we wanted to test our recall metric to see if it could distinguish a generative model that seems to be doing a good job from one that doesn't seem to be doing as well. So here again, I'm showing the true full res and downsampled images on the top. And then on the bottom left, I'm showing the current generator, or the generator that we use to get all of our results for this work. And then on the right, I'm showing a previous generator that we trained that doesn't seem to be doing as well as capturing the set of plausible inputs. It seems to miss key regions of these images and just doesn't seem to approximate the space as well. And so if we compute our recall metric on both of these models, you can see that the recall for this for the current generator is much, much higher. So we're able to actually distinguish the fact that this generator is doing a much better job than this previous one. So to summarize, we showed how we can extend state-based neural network verification techniques to verify the closed-loop behavior of image-based neural network controllers. To do this, we trained a generative model to approximate the set of plausible input images. We concatenated it with our control network to verify safety. And in doing this, we were able to obtain a network that looked a lot like the state-based neural network controllers we were using before. And so we used that to verify safety. And then in order to assess the strength of our guarantees, we came up with the recall metric to validate how well our generative model is doing at capturing the set of plausible inputs. Okay, so that wraps up the first half of the talk on safety verification. So again, there we were assuming that we had already designed a system we thought was safe, and we were trying to formally prove that it was in fact safe. And now I'm going to move on to the second half of the talk, where I talk about how we could actually go about designing safe perception systems in the first place. Starting with this contribution on risk-driven design of perception systems. This is that contribution Michael was talking about in Edinburgh earlier. So the key insight that we build on in this work is that not all errors that a perception system makes will have an equal effect on the overall safety of the closed loop system. So to demonstrate this, we can use an inverted pendulum scenario where we assume that we have a pendulum that we need to apply the necessary torque to in order to keep it upright. And with perfect perception, we see that this system seems to work pretty well. But now let's imagine that we can actually only estimate the current state of the pendulum by feeding frames of noisy images taken from a camera through a neural network in order to estimate its angle and angular velocity. So we can simulate what the scenario looks like now with imperfect perception. And you can see that it has a little bit more trouble keeping this pendulum upright. However, not all of these errors are actually affecting the system equally. So to demonstrate this, let's consider two possible perception errors, 15 degrees clockwise and 15 degrees counterclockwise. So while both of these errors might appear similar at first, let's see what happens if we simulate both of these scenarios. So the scenario on the right results in a failure to remain upright, while the scenario on the left is actually able to keep the pendulum upright. So why is this? Well, let's look at each of these errors a little bit more closely. So in the scenario on the left, the perception system thinks that the pendulum is tipped over more than it actually is, which just causes it to apply a more conservative torque at this time step to move the pendulum toward upright. However, if we look at the scenario on the right, the perception system thinks that the pendulum is closer to upright than it actually is, which causes it to not apply enough torque at this time step, and ultimately puts stress on the entire closed loop system. However, if we evaluate both of these errors using a traditional mean squared error loss, you'll notice that both of these errors are penalized equally. And so the key idea that we had in this work is that if we can actually somehow account for this riskiness of making certain perception errors on the overall safety of the closed loop system, we could potentially design safer perception systems. So the way that we propose to do this involves two steps. The first is to formulate a risk function, which we'll call rho, that takes in the true state of the system, along with a perception error epsilon, and then it outputs a value related to the riskiness on closed loop safety of making perception error epsilon in state S. So for example, for the pendulum problem, it will output a higher value for the more risky error. Once we've formulated this risk function, we can then use it during the design process to try to train a safer perception system. And we came up with two ways to do this. One for incorporating it into the training process, and one for incorporating it into the data generation process. So diving a little bit more into each of these steps, starting with how we formulate this risk function, we assume that we have this perception system that takes in an image observation and outputs an estimate of the current state. The controller, we then have a controller that uses this estimate to select a control action. The agent takes the action and the environment produces a new observation to close the loop. However, there's one problem here, which is that we want to formulate this risk function before we've actually designed this perception system. So we actually don't have this component of the loop yet. And so for this reason, we abstract this perception system with a notional error model that takes in the true state of the system and samples a perception error epsilon in order to produce an estimated state. And what's really nice about this formulation is that we can actually view it as an agent with a stochastic policy and a Markov decision process. And this in turn allows us to use distributional dynamic programming in order to estimate the distribution over future costs when making perception error epsilon in state S. Then to obtain a notion of risk, we could just take the expectation of this distribution. However, as I mentioned, we're just using a notional error model of the perception system before we've actually designed the perception system. And so for this reason, it's possible that there will be a mismatch between the true errors that the perception system makes and this error model. So to be a little bit more conservative, we replace this expectation with the conditional value at risk, and then this becomes our risk function. Once we formulated this risk function, we can now incorporate it into the perception system design process. For risk-driven training, we can take whatever baseline loss function we were using, so maybe, for example, mean squared error, and then we can add on this risk function to penalize risky errors. For risk-driven data generation, we come up with this weighting function that compares the risk of making the worst case perception error in a particular state to the risk of making no error. And then we can actually focus our data collection efforts on states that where it's very risky to make a non-zero perception error. So to test these risk-driven design approaches, we apply them on top of a vision-based aircraft detect and avoid example, where, as I mentioned earlier, we essentially have this own chip that needs to detect other aircraft by taking images of the sky, feeding them through a neural network to produce these detections, and then selecting a control action to avoid colliding with them. And more specifically, we applied our methods on top of a baseline YOLO v5 object detection architecture and evaluated the number of near mid-air collisions on a set of aircraft encounters. You can see that just adding these risk-driven design approaches on top of this already strong baseline YOLO object detection network, we were able to reduce collision risk by up to 37%. And here's just an example encounter from this encounter set, where our risk-driven approach, which will be shown in blue, was able to actually successfully resolve this encounter, while the baseline model was not. And you can see that this risk-driven approach makes detections at very key points in the encounter in order to keep this overall risk low, and ultimately is able to resolve an impending collision. So to summarize, I talked about how we can do risk-driven design of perception systems by formulating a risk function that quantifies the effect of making certain perception errors on the overall safety of the closed loop system, and then showed how we could use it to design safer perception systems. Okay, so that brings me to my last contribution, which is also related to safe design. I'm not going to spend quite as much time on this one, just for the sake of time. But essentially, it relates to the efficient determination of safety requirements for perception systems. So the overall goal here is very similar to the risk-driven design goal, where in the risk-driven approach, we were trying to translate closed-loop safety properties to a notion of risk of making perception errors. And in this case, we're trying to now translate closed-loop safety properties to specific requirements for the performance of our perception system. So I'll bring back this aircraft collision avoidance example one more time. We're going to assume it has some suite of sensors and a perception system that's able to detect intruding aircraft. And this perception system has some set of properties. So for example, field of view and detection range. And then we're going to also assume that we have access to a black box simulator that can take in some instantiation of these properties, simulate an episode, and tell us whether or not a success or failure occurred. So for an aircraft collision avoidance example, the simulator would simulate an aircraft encounter and tell us whether or not it resulted in a collision. And then if we run this black box simulator in a Monte Carlo fashion, we can use it to estimate the probability of failure given this particular instantiation of our perception system performance characteristics. If we then compare this probability of failure with some desired safety threshold, we can decide whether or not this point was safe. So in this case, I'm going to assume that it was. And essentially, though, our goal is to actually determine the full set of performance characteristics such that the system will be safe, so we can specify this kind of broad range of requirements. So one way we could do this is to just grid up this space and then do a Monte Carlo analysis at each of these points and determine whether or not it resulted in a desired level of safety. And this could essentially be used to estimate our safe set. But the issue here is that Monte Carlo simulations or Monte Carlo analyses tend to be quite computationally expensive on their own. And as soon as you talk about doing it for every single point in a grid, this problem quickly becomes intractable. And so our goal in this work is to actually efficiently determine this set of safe performance characteristics. And without going into too many details, the way that we do this is essentially by taking advantage of two key properties of the estimation problem. The first is spatial correlation, which just means that nearby perception system performance characteristics are likely to exhibit similar safety properties. And then the second, which is potentially even more unique to this problem, is the multi-level nature of the estimation problem. So at a high level, we're trying to estimate this safe set of performance characteristics, but doing that requires us to solve a lower level estimation problem where we estimate the probability of failure for each of those individual performance characteristics. And it turns out that there's techniques in black box estimation that are able to kind of address both of these properties individually. And the technique that we come up with essentially kind of combines the best of both worlds so that we can address them both simultaneously in order to essentially efficiently enumerate these safe sets. Okay, so to summarize, I talked about 4 contributions today related to safe machine learning-based perception. The first 2 were related to safety verification, where we had a perception system that we thought was safe, and we wanted to check that it actually did satisfy our intended safety objectives. And then the second half of the talk focused on how we could actually go about designing safe systems in the first place. These contributions leave multiple avenues for future work. One avenue is falsification. So while we use a lot of these techniques to prove the absence of failures, I think that a lot of them could probably be adapted in order to efficiently find failures of systems so that we can fix them before we actually deploy the systems. The second is runtime monitoring, which I'm going to come back to in a second. And then the final area for future work is accounting for history dependence. So I think this is very unique to perception systems because perception systems lend themselves quite naturally to filtering-based approaches, which rely on a full history of states that we've been in rather than just the current state. And none of these works actually accounted for this history. And I think going forward into the future, it'll be really important when we think about these perception system safety techniques to account for this history dependence. Okay, and I just want to wrap up by going to this last area of future work, because I think it's going to be really, really critical when we want to deploy these systems in the real world. And the reason for that is that all of these techniques that I talked about today relied on some set of assumptions. So we had to decide what is the set of inputs we want to verify over, what are the safety properties that we want it to satisfy, et cetera. And I think as we deploy these systems in more and more complex environments, it's going to become impractical, if not impossible, for us as system designers to actually quantify the full set of assumptions that we need to make in order to capture all of the possible scenarios that our system might encounter in the real world. And so I think the next best thing we can do is essentially deploy these systems with runtime monitors so that we can determine when the assumptions that we designed and verified for are potentially being violated. And if we do this, we can potentially flag failures before they actually occur. And so I'll just mention like one really quick way that I think we could extend this technique to do this. So in this technique, we had actually trained this generative model that captured the whole set of inputs that we expected to see. And we verified that our image-based controller would work for that set of inputs. And so if we could somehow easily check whether or not online at runtime, we are getting an input that actually comes from this distribution, we have the potential to deploy a very robust system. Here's a list of publications that I've been involved in during my time at Stanford. The ones that I discussed today are highlighted in blue.